Every country on Earth is in debt. The United States owes $38 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. The entire planet owes $338 trillion, more than 3 times the size of the global economy. But here is the paradox that should terrify you. If everyone owes money, who exactly is it owed to? The answer isn't what you think. Because when you follow the chain of creditors, when you track who actually holds the paper, you discover something disturbing. The world doesn't owe money to aliens. It doesn't owe money to a shadow government. Technically, the world owes money to itself. But 4 bankers across 3 centuries, designed it that way deliberately. They built a system where debt can never be repaid, where governments borrow forever, where interest flows eternally upward, and where the people who designed the trap profit from every payment, every crisis, and every bailout. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. The meetings happened. The contracts exist. Once you see how they built it, you'll understand why $38 trillion isn't a problem to be solved. It's the system working exactly as designed. 1. William Patterson, the architect of perpetual debt, 1694. Let's go back to where the trap was set. 1694. Before this year, kings borrowed money the old way. If a king needed money for war, he'd go to merchants or nobles. He promised to pay it back with interest. If he couldn't pay, he defaulted. The lenders lost their money. The king was embarrassed, but the debt was gone. It was risky for the lenders, but it was temporary debt. The system cleared. England was at war, the 9 Years' War, against France. King William III was desperate. The treasury was empty. Traditional lenders refused new loans because England had a notorious history of defaulting on debts. The monarchy had zero financial credibility. This crisis of war and insolvency paved the way for the ultimate solution. Enter William Patterson, a Scottish merchant and financial schemer who had failed at almost everything he tried. But in 1694, he had an idea that would reshape civilization. Patterson approached the king with a radical proposal. He would organize a group of wealthy merchants to lend the government £1.2 million. A massive sum, even today. But here was the twist. The loan would never be repaid. The principal, the $1.2 million, would stay with the government forever. The debt was made perpetual. This was the political genius. By making the debt perpetual, Patterson shifted the crown's financial vulnerability onto Parliament. The lenders knew they couldn't trust the king, but they could trust Parliament's taxing power. The financial power of the nation subtly moved from the monarchy to the rising merchant class. Instead, the government would only pay interest, a guaranteed 8% a year, forever. To manage this arrangement and guarantee the annual payments, Patterson proposed a new institution, the Bank of England. The mechanics were revolutionary. The subscribing merchants handed their capital to the new Bank of England. The bank, in turn, loaned this sum immediately to the crown. The government agreed to pay a fixed, guaranteed interest rate annually, funded by a dedicated tax on the English people. Why would merchants agree to never get their gold back? Because the interest was guaranteed by Parliament's taxing power. As long as England could tax its citizens, the annual check would clear. But the true genius was in the leverage. Because the government's debt was seen as good as gold, the bank was given the right to issue new paper notes, banknotes, equal to the value of the loan. They effectively turned the king's debt into cash. The more the king borrowed, the more money the bank could print. This was the subtle, powerful birth of the concept of fractional reserve banking, the idea that the debt itself could be leveraged to create a new money supply. For the first time in history, national debt wasn't a bug. It was a feature. The government borrowed, the bankers collected the interest, and the debt itself became currency. Patterson died in 1719, not particularly rich. But his system conquered the world. Within 50 years, every major power copied it. The newly formed United States, under Alexander Hamilton, explicitly modeled its financial system on Patterson's Bank of England. The immediate consequence of this system was the creation of a vast, speculative market in public debt. This culminated in the South Sea Bubble of 1720. The Bank of England system had taught investors that government debt was the safest investment, leading to rampant speculation in public debt schemes. When the South Sea Company collapsed, it wiped out thousands of fortunes, proving that while debt was made permanent, the speculative chaos it fueled was wildly temporary. It was the first catastrophic lesson in the systemic risk introduced by making debt the foundation of a nation's currency. 331 years later, that original debt from 1694 has never been paid off. It was just refinanced, rolled over, and expanded. The trap was set. It was permanent, but it was still localized to domestic lenders. It needed someone to make it global. 2. Nathan Rothschild, the trader of global debt, 1815. By the early 1800s, governments were addicted to debt. They borrowed for every war, every canal, every royal whim. But there was no organized global market for it. Each loan was negotiated individually. You couldn't easily sell a king's debt to someone in another country. If you lived in London and lent to France, you had to hold that risk. Nathan Rothschild changed that. He industrialized sovereign debt. The Rothschild family established banking houses in 5 major European cities: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. This was the world's first true multinational corporation. They had a sophisticated network of couriers and informants that could move gold and critical market information across borders faster than any government. This gave them an edge known as information arbitrage. They knew the market before the market knew itself. Nathan's innovation wasn't simply lending money. Instead, he would buy government bonds at a discount and then immediately resell them to an international network of investors, pension funds, and insurance companies. He created the secondary market. Now, a British government bond could be owned by a French count who sold it to a German bank who used it as collateral for a loan to an Austrian aristocrat. This interdependence was key. Then came 1815, the Battle of Waterloo. The legend says Nathan manipulated the stock market by getting news of the victory early. While historians debate the exact details of that day, the fact remains: the Rothschild courier network was faster than the British government's. He knew Napoleon was crushed before the king did. The Rothschilds emerged from the war as the masters of Europe's debt. Their wealth was built on one source: interest on sovereign debt. But Nathan's real innovation wasn't a single trade. It was the spiderweb. Before Rothschild, if a country defaulted, one bank took a loss. After Rothschild, because the debt was traded globally, a default in London could crash banks in Paris and Vienna. He made debt so interconnected that default became impossible. Not because governments suddenly became honest, but because default would trigger a systemic collapse of the civilized world. Governments were trapped. They had to pay, and they had to keep borrowing to pay the interest on old debts. Crucially, the Rothschild network became the de facto credit rating agency of the era. If a country needed a loan, the entire international market looked to Rothschild. His participation alone was a seal of approval. His refusal was a kiss of death, ensuring a country couldn't access global capital. This mechanism forced compliance and stability, guaranteeing the bondholders would always get paid. The debt trap was no longer just permanent. It was inescapable. By making the debt international, Nathan ensured that every major financial center had skin in the game. But the trap was still limited by one thing: the supply of gold and the actual cash available from savers. It needed a mechanism to make it truly infinite. 3. J.P. Morgan, the monopolist of infinite debt, 1913. Fast forward to America, 1900. The U.S. was an economic giant, but a financial dwarf. Thousands of small, independent banks. No central safety net. Money supply was tied directly to gold, which meant if people panicked, the entire system froze. J.P. Morgan decided to fix that. Not for the public good, for his banking empire. In 1907, a massive financial panic hit Wall Street. The stock market fell 50%. Banks collapsed. Morgan personally organized the bailout. He gathered the nation's top bankers in his library, locked the doors, and forced them to pledge their own money to stabilize failing institutions. It worked. But Morgan was 70 years old. He knew he couldn't personally do it again. He needed a permanent, institutional mechanism to guarantee the supply of money and debt. In November 1910, a private train car with the blinds drawn left New Jersey. On board were Senator Nelson Aldrich and representatives from the largest, most powerful banks in America. They traveled to a remote hunting club on Jekyll Island, Georgia. For 9 days, in total secrecy, they designed the legislation that would become the Federal Reserve System. They knew Americans deeply hated central banks, so they disguised it. They called it a system. It wouldn't be one institution. It would be 12 regional banks. It looked decentralized and public, but the structure ensured banker control. The regional Federal Reserve banks were privately owned by the member commercial banks, and the most important power, the power to create money, was concentrated in the New York branch, controlled by Wall Street. The Federal Reserve Act passed Congress in December 1913, and immediately, the debt trap went infinite. Before the Fed, the government could only borrow what actual savers could lend. There was a limit, but with the Federal Reserve, the government issues a bond. The Fed buys it with newly created money. This created infinite demand for government debt. The government never has to stop borrowing because the Fed will always be there to buy it. The immediate and devastating consequence of this infinite mechanism was felt just 3 years later with World War I. Without the Federal Reserve's unlimited capacity to purchase government bonds, the U.S. government could never have raised the billions needed to finance its entry into the war. The Fed, the ultimate buyer, enabled the industrial scale of war financing, a scale that was simply impossible under the previous gold-backed system. This proved, almost instantly, that the Federal Reserve was the machine of limitless debt, ready to be leveraged for geopolitical power. Morgan died the same year the Fed was created, but his legacy is the structure that allowed the U.S. debt to go from $3 billion in 1913 to $38 trillion today. The trap was now permanent, global, and unlimited, but it needed an enforcement mechanism. 4. Paul Volcker, the enforcer of inescapable debt, 1982. By the 1970s, the debt trap built by the three architects was functioning perfectly in the developed world. But there was one loose end: developing nations. Countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina had borrowed billions from Western banks for infrastructure projects. Then came inflation. Enter Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve. To kill inflation, he raised interest rates dramatically. The federal funds rate went from $11% to $20% It crushed American inflation. It destroyed everyone else. Developing nations, who had adjustable rate loans, suddenly saw their interest payments triple. They couldn't pay. In August 1982, Mexico announced it was defaulting. This should have triggered a global financial collapse. American banks had lent most of that money. If Mexico defaulted, Wall Street would take massive losses. Volcker didn't let the market crash. He, along with the IMF, orchestrated a bailout. But they didn't forgive the debt. They restructured it. They lent these countries new money just to pay the interest on the old money. In exchange, the IMF demanded structural adjustment programs, SAPs. These were not suggestions. They were non-negotiable mandates designed to guarantee Western banks would be repaid. The three key pillars of the SAPs were austerity, massively cut government spending on social programs, healthcare, and education. Privatization, forced the sale of state-owned assets, telecoms, electricity, oil companies, to foreign corporations at fire sale prices. Trade liberalization, eliminate tariffs, and open the national economy to cheap foreign imports, often destroying domestic industries. Essentially, they dismantled the economic sovereignty of these nations. This was the Volcker innovation, the debt prison. When debt becomes unpayable, you don't erase it. You use it as a leash. You strip the country of its sovereignty in exchange for the privilege of staying in debt forever. The debt is never eliminated. It's just refinanced into permanent indebtedness. We saw it with Greece. We saw it with Sri Lanka. The tactic is identical. The national wealth is sold off to service the perpetual debt, ensuring the global financial elite always gets its payment. 5. The geopolitical counteroffensive, de-dollarization. The debt trap, however, has a pressure point: geopolitics. For decades, the system relied on the dollar's supremacy. Nations, tired of being controlled by the dollar debt system, are actively building a parallel financial infrastructure. This movement is known as de-dollarization. The spearhead of this movement is the BRICS bloc: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They are not asking for permission. They are actively working to bypass the debt trap entirely. China's strategy: the gold yuan pivot. China is the largest trading partner for over 120 nations. It is rapidly expanding the use of the yuan, renminbi, in global trade. Crucially, China has become the world's largest buyer and producer of physical gold. By linking their currency, the yuan, to gold and offering it for trade, They are creating a non-dollar anchor for global commerce. This directly undermines the petrodollar system, which is the cornerstone of the debt trap. Russia's strategy: weaponized commodities. Following sanctions, Russia demanded payment for its natural gas and oil in rubles or gold from unfriendly nations. This forced buyers to engage with non-dollar currencies, creating a precedent for bypassing the SWIFT system and the U.S. financial gatekeepers. The BRICS payment system. The bloc is actively developing alternative payment and lending mechanisms outside of the IMF and World Bank. Institutions Volcker used to enforce the debt prison. By creating their own reserve currency and interbank payment system, they are offering developing nations a crucial alternative, a way to borrow and trade without forfeiting their economic sovereignty to the IMF's austerity demands. This geopolitical counteroffensive is the first true challenge to the 300-year-old debt architecture. The debt trap may still exist, but the exit door is finally being constructed, brick by gold-backed brick. 6. The endgame, the reset, and the psychological contract. The final chapter is the consequence, the reset. The debt trap built by the four architects created an inescapable economic loop, but it rests on a fragile psychological foundation, the psychological contract of fiat currency. The fiat system, where money is backed by nothing but faith, works because citizens believe the government will maintain the dollar's purchasing power. You accept dollars for your labor because you believe others will accept them later for food, rent, and retirement. The $38 trillion debt is a lie that society agrees to believe. When the debt becomes mathematically impossible, the government doesn't declare bankruptcy. It breaks the psychological contract through devaluation, inflation. The Great Wealth Transfer. Every year, the U.S. government takes $1 trillion of your tax money and hands it to bondholders as interest. This continuous, invisible transfer flows directly into the hands of the financial institutions that manage the vast majority of U.S. bonds, firms like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. This concentration of $$38 trillion in systemic risk guarantees that these institutions are truly too big to fail. They are the ultimate beneficiaries of the debt trap. This concentration of wealth is the end goal. Debt is an asset that produces guaranteed, perpetual income. The exit strategy, the survival plan. The system is financially inescapable, but it is not inevitable for you. The architects built a trap for governments, but they left a loophole for the individual. The solution is to withdraw your faith from the fiat contract and place it into things the debt system cannot create. De-dollarize your savings. Shift capital out of fiat instruments. Bonds are death. Cash, beyond 3 months of expenses, is a depreciated asset. Acquire hard assets. Own things that cannot be printed. Gold, the anti-fiat commodity. Bitcoin, the anti-fiat currency. Productive real estate, farmland, income property. Build resilience. The debt trap destroys the national economy, but it cannot destroy local value. Invest in community and skill. When the currency fails, what matters is what you can do and who you know. If you want to know how to position yourself before the reset happens, hit that subscribe button. I'm going to show you the way out. Because the architects built a prison, but they didn't lock the door.